Right, sure, will we dive straight in, so?
Let's do it.
Colfer, and welcome to Spokes. Our guest in this episode is Frankie Gaffney, an Irish writer and linguist from Dublin City. In this episode, he talks about his love of James Joyce's Ulysses, his hatred of school, and his subsequent return to education to study English at Trinity College at age 24. He also talks about linguistics, about getting his PhD, and about some of the articles he's written for the Irish Times, including one in particular which resulted in a pile-on against him. I started by asking him about his childhood.
So I was born in Holles Street, which we always associate with kind of the more posher people in Dublin, and they say, the Northsiders are all the Rotunda, or the more working class Southsiders in the Coombe. But my mum and dad lived in Percy Place, in kind of a bedsit or something there. My mum was quite young; she was 17 when she got pregnant and stuff like that. And so I can't think of my earliest memory, but one of the memories I've been told about that time is my dad wouldn't get out of bed to go down and register my birth after I've been born. So his name's not on the birth cert or anything like that. There's just a stroke. I seen the birth cert and there's just a stroke where father should be. So that probably accords with some of your ideology, Colette.
What do you mean, my ideology?
No, I'm just slagging because the idea of Joyce said fatherhood is a legal fiction, and emphasised motherhood a lot more.
Oh, really? Joyce did?
Yeah. Joyce said that, but I think he probably had a similar relationship that I did with my dad, because my dad was very entertaining, and I've realised that he did have an influence on me in a lot of ways, some positive ways, like kind of a irreverence and a disrespect for authority and stuff like that. And Joyce says, I can't remember exactly, but he said my father was a shouting politician, something in a bank, salesman for a distillery, a tax collector, went to through all these jobs that his dad had, and then at the end it says, and currently a praiser of his own past. So Joyce was kind of he was very uncomplimentary about his dad, I suppose, and very Joyce said that you always feel a guilt towards your mother because it's the one debt you can't repay in life. If your dad gives you money, you can give him money back, or if somebody looks after you when you're sick, you can look after them when they're sick, but you can't give birth to your mother. So he said you always had a special connection with your ma that couldn't be broken,
And would you agree with that?
Yeah, certainly. But I suppose, listen, it depends on, case by case. And, some of my friends have been brought up by their dads. And so they probably feel that way towards them. But certainly in my case, I have a very special connection with my mum. My mum, was always very encouraging towards me. She always gave me books. She always, I remember, one of the things I think that's really influenced me as a writer and in my academic work as well is when I was a kid, I used to do drawings, and my ma would kind of give me feedback on them. And she'd say, I like the way you've done the shading here, but the perspective is not good, or the proportions, you've drawn the heads too big. That was a constant refrain. I think, kids tend to do that, don't they? And, I think I really craved that, positive, not just positive feedback, but constructive criticism. And I remember showing drawings to me granny, and she's just like, "Oh yeah, that's very good." And it didn't feel like the same thing at all. So I think that was something I got from my mad. I didn't get anywhere else, and I think it was really important in developing critical kind of faculties, or whatever you want to call it, when it comes to art and when it comes to literature and all of that. I think it was easily transferable.
So at the moment, what are you up to at the moment?
I am still writing. I'm still writing. I'm working on academic stuff. And I've plans for getting back into writing fiction that I won't reveal. Go on.
Sorry. Have you finished your PhD?
Yeah, PhD is done. I finished the PhD a good while ago. Couldn't graduate because of COVID, obviously. So, I wanted to have a real life graduation ceremony. We could have done the virtual thing, and I didn't really fancy sitting on a couch in a gown with a glass of prosecco on my own. I didn't go to my undergraduate graduation or my master's graduation, and so I was kind of looking forward to a day out and take my out and make a bit of a noise about it, when the PhD was done. So it was a bit of an anticlimax, but hopefully we'll get to do it in real life soon enough.
So at the moment, then you're compiling academic articles from the material of the PhD, really, is it? And
no, I've written a couple of articles. I wanted to keep the ball rolling, so they're related to the PhD in the sense that I use linguistics to analyse literature, and that's really what I'm interested in terms of literary criticism. But they're very different from the subject of the PhD. So the PhD was on spelling, punctuation, and typography, and the papers I've written now, one of them is kind of about dialect in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and the other one I won't talk about because it's the specific theory that I've come up with, and I want to test the waters with it a little bit first and get some feedback on it before I throw it out there. But I suppose something you might be more interested in is how I got into that area of literary studies in the first place. So I done my undergraduate degree in English at Trinity, and I really loved it. Some brilliant lecturers, and it was just really engaging about reading, all of these new novels and plays and poetry that I hadn't been exposed to before, and learning about the historical milieu that produced them and stuff like this with some of the best lecturers in the world. But I did feel at the end of the course that we focused on the plot, the characters. We focused, on a lot on certain political modes of criticism. So post-colonial criticism, Marxist criticism, even feminist criticism, and stuff like that. And while I think all of those lenses are useful lenses in understanding literary texts, I kind of wanted to go back to fundamentals a little bit. And texts are composed of language. And I also felt that sometimes in some of the secondary source material we're reading, there was a bit of a lack of rigor, certainly the postmodernist stuff. And I wanted something that was a bit more rigorous. So linguistics, is a scientific study of language, and I think it's perfectly it's a perfectly acceptable practice to apply the scientific study of language to literary texts, and I think it's actually a very beneficial approach. So I felt it was something a bit more meaty and a bit more empirical than a lot of the approaches that we'd kind of engage with. We did a brilliant course called Critical Culture and Theory, so we got to try on all these different critical hats, and there wasn't much linguistics in it. Saussure was in it, but the linguistics hat was the one I was most interested in. So the fundamental object of study is linguistic, when you're studying literary texts. So I think it's a really good way to approach trying to understand literature.
Right. So you did a PhD. You tell me again, spelling, grammar?
Spelling, punctuation, and typography. So basically my argument was that most of the time when academics are talking about literature, they could be talking about audio versions of the books and the poems and stuff like that they're discussing, because they're talking about, say, post-colonial theory, and how it's affected the construction of the text or whatever. And my argument was that, look, if we're talking about novels, say, and I was specifically focusing on novels, if we're talking about novels are books, and we engage with novels by reading them, not by listening to them. And so we have to pay attention to the appearance of the text. So, typography in terms of font choice, but also like italics and capitalization and those practices within text, and punctuation. Like I wrote, a case study on ellipsis points, ... And I spent about a year writing about ellipsis points, and I thought I was going to be like the ellipsis point expert in the world. And then this academic came out with a monograph, Anne Toner, she came out with a monograph on ellipsis points in literature that same year. So I had to go back and integrate her opinions on the matter into the thing. And I'm certainly no longer the world's ellipsis point in literature expert. But the argument in that segment on ellipsis points was that they used to use a dash for the functions that we use ellipsis points for now, to represent a pause or whatever. And I argued that the ellipsis points better convey an actual pause, because there's a rhythmic element to how we conceive of time. If you think of a heartbeat or the ticking of a clock or whatever, and the ellipsis points convey that visually, dot, dot, dot. So it seems like a pause. And I said, I suppose, the conclusion I came to was why they didn't come in earlier. They came in at a specific point, kind of the interwar period. And that was the period when the typewriter came to prominence. Mark Twain submitted the first typewritten manuscript. But at the stage he submitted it, it was still like a piece of office equipment, much like computers in the 1970s, where only big companies had them. So the typewriter, I think, changed how people produce writing. And we often talk about the transition from manuscript to print. But it's very rarely talked about the effect that the transition from handwriting to typewriting had on literature, say, for example, but also, how we produce text generally. I think it's interesting now as well, because we're living in an age where there's more text, and we're producing more text than we ever did in the history of humanity. And yourself, nobody answers the phone anymore. Everybody just wants to text so they can check their notifications while they're typing out a message to you. So it's interesting to look retrospectively at those issues now, because I think, again, the technology is really influencing the way we write now. For example, when text messages first started off, there was this brilliant creativity in it, and people were writing in their local dialect. So, for example, they were dropping the G off standing to just write standing, STANDIN, without a G, to represent the way they pronounced it. And then they were using dialectal words like Frankie's gaff instead of Frankie's house. But they stopped doing that because of predictive text. And now people, it's kind of homogenized. So, again, those little cultural peculiarities were ironed out by, this technology. And, you've lots of opinions as well, I'm sure, about how social media has that effect in lots of ways of homogenizing discourse and homogenizing the way we interact with each other.
And you said that it's important that we read text or look at it. Why?
I don't think, it's necessary for everyone to do it in their day-to-day lives so much. But for somebody who's interested in studying literature, Samuel Beckett said this about Joyce. He said, it's not only to be read, it's to be looked at and listened to. And what he meant is that Joyce wrote in a way that the appearance of the text on the page was important. So, for example, he put in newspaper headlines and stuff like this. That doesn't really translate well into an audio version. You can't see that it's written all in capitals like a newspaper headline. Do you know what I mean? So that's what I mean by looking at it rather than reading it. And there's little cues like that. Like, for example, there's like so-called chick-lit versions of Jane Austen that have, like a cover like the Bridget Jones Diaries. And they kind of inflect how someone picks up that text then. They think of it then not as some snotty, 18th century literature, but as a fun text that is, young people can enjoy, say, or whatever. It doesn't seem like this academic text. And in those so-called chick-lit versions of Jane Austen, in the more classic versions then of Jane Austen, they had bits at the very start of each chapter in one of the editions of Jane Austen. They had bits that kind of imitated handwriting to give this impression of writing at the time. And again, that wouldn't translate into an audio version of the text. So that's what I mean by looking at literary texts, I think there's a lot of information that gets completely neglected by literary critics, by some literary critics, because they conceive of the text in terms of the story and the characters, or very often just in political terms that are sometimes anachronistic, and kind of moralistic as well. that I don't think is a very fruitful way to study literature often.
You said there about you're doing your degree. You really enjoyed your degree, but I know that your schooling, your education, secondary school wasn't necessarily something you did enjoy, or was it? And you just tell us about school for you.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't be too negative about it because, like, there were some great teachers there, and in hindsight, I did probably learn a lot, particularly in history and geography classes. But, like, Jesus Christ, I hated school. Like, I hated it. I would do anything to get out of there. And I was just like, I remember one time going to the shop for my man. I came back with the change and I handed it to her, and there was a note in it. And I went to an all-Irish school, so it said, Pruntius needs to go to the dentist at, 11:30 today or whatever. And I was after writing it myself. I was like, oh no. But I was just going on the mitch the whole time. We actually found a way out through the basement at one stage as well, and we used to climb down there like the Great Escape or something like that, and get out. So yeah, I wasn't there. Apparently I had the worst attendance on record at that school, they said to me. And then in sixth year, the teacher came down to read out an essay to the class as an example of how to write an essay, and it was my essay. And she said, so this is a brilliant essay, this is what you should be aiming for. And Pruntius wrote it, and he's not here, but it's very interesting to note that he was marked in this morning at roll call or whatever. So it obviously sneaked out in the interim. So yeah, I didn't apply myself at all. Mentally I was a million miles away from school and I had no interest in it. And so I was out there.
Why did you hate it so much?
I don't know. Part of it, I think, is possibly, a very simple thing of, sleep cycle. And, they say teenagers need more sleep and sleep later and stuff like this. And certainly I felt zombified going into school at we were in 20 to 9, we were in. So I think if I started later, I might have had a better chance. My Irish wasn't good. I hadn't been to an all-Irish primary school, and I was in an all-Irish secondary school, so that didn't help either. But I don't know. Like, I look at my little brother as well, and he's left school now. He's left school, but not by choice. But he just hated it as well, and he was fine. Primary school, he was grand. He was in every day, and then secondary school. So I don't know. I think it just feels constrictive, or I don't know. But even, when I think about university as well, I wouldn't have thrived at university if I had gone when I was 18 or anything like that. Like, I was 24 or 25 when I went back. And yeah, I don't know.
It wasn't social aspect to school then. I didn't like social aspect.
Yeah, I wasn't popular in school. There was a little bit of bullying. I wasn't bullied too bad. So there was a couple of kids who had been bullied, quite badly in the school and left our class and stuff like that. But I wasn't popular. I didn't really, have good friends there. I didn't go in and enjoy it. So I wasn't into sports either. And the school was quite into sports. Wes Houlihan was in my class, who plays for Ireland, or played for Ireland. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, there wasn't anything really keeping me there. You know what I mean? And this is the thing. Like, I was big into reading still and stuff like that. And I remember one time that the teacher wrote home because in Irish class he'd come down and caught me reading a book under the desk. I was reading Jean Kerrigan's Hard Cases, about gangland crime in Dublin, and it concerned him that I'd been reading it for the whole year for the whole term or whatever, under the table, and not paying any attention to what the teacher was saying. So he sent a note home to me ma about that. So yeah.
And what brought you back then? Like, or why did you think you said it was 24 when you went back to to education. So what put the seed of the idea into your head to even think of going back?
Yeah, I suppose like that. Like, I'd say I was very lucky that my ma was, quite intellectually engaged. The house was always full of books. I'd been kind of involved in politics when I was a teenager, and activism and stuff like that. And, I'd say that came from my ma as well. And, I'd got into a lot of trouble then in the interim years. And I needed to get out of the life I was living, certainly.
What kind of trouble?
Various kinds of trouble. I've gotten various kinds of trouble. Do you know what I mean? I probably, shouldn't go into it, but it was getting to a stage where, I could have ended up either in prison or dead or something like that. At that stage. So it kind of was time to extricate myself. But I often think, and some people have given me real credit for this. Oh, it's great the way you turned your life around and all this kind of stuff. But the fact of the matter is, the people that I know that ended up, say, shot or in prison or whatever, they didn't have the opportunity that I had, because I had always been encouraged to read and always encouraged to discuss art and literature and politics and stuff like that at home. They just didn't have that, and they didn't have the I suppose the fundamental kind of basis to adjust easily to university life. Now, I didn't do TAP. There's a Trinity Access program that I think is very good, or seems to have got a lot of people that wouldn't have gone to university otherwise, and given them that basis to go on to study. It's a 1-year access course. I didn't do that at the time. You just interviewed, so I didn't need my leaving cert. I failed my leaving cert and all. So I just did a few interviews and wrote a sample piece or whatever for Trinity and got in that way. And at the time as well, the back to education allowance was quite generous, and there was rent allowance and grants on top of the back to education allowance. So you could live, you could afford to support yourself and go for a meal, say, twice a month or whatever as well, and not just live like a pauper. And I think it's very, very difficult for young people now, or mature students, anybody that wants to go back to university now, if they're only getting back to education allowance. And, if you're going into Trinity, you're going in with some very wealthy young people who have also had the benefit of a private schooling as well. So, the system, I think, is very unfair. And I think I was very lucky to just be at that time, when there was a generous back to education scheme that was essentially nearly double what it is today. So yeah, I think I was very lucky.
And how did you feel? Like, that must have been weird at 24, from the background you were from, like having failed your leaving cert and, in dodgy situations for the previous years, and suddenly you're in Trinity College with the how would you say, like, the private educated and the most well off in the country, I suppose. That must have been weird.
Yeah, I had like a chip on my shoulder, and I was very insecure as well. And this always amazes people when I say it now, but I didn't talk really at tutorials very much. Certainly for the first couple of years, and I actually used to have panic attacks and shit the night before a tutorial, if I knew that I was going to have to speak, and certainly if I had to give a presentation. And like now, if I go on telly or anything now, live TV, it doesn't faze me at all. I'm just thinking, like, when is it my turn to talk again? But then I used to get very nervous, and it was difficult. And it's good that young people are very confident and stuff like that. And not everybody as well, like from a private school background, has an easy life. Do you know what I mean? I mean, they could have an incredibly emotionally distant father or parents that are just concerned with their careers or whatever, and there's plenty of those people with serious mental health issues and all of that. So I don't want to fall into this trap of like, oh, I had it so much harder or whatever. Like some of that was personal as well. Like not everybody from my background would feel self-conscious or whatever. So but I suppose for me, I didn't feel I fit in. I didn't make many friends. And I kind of kept a bit of a distance, I suppose, intentionally as well. I suppose, look, at that stage as well, like I had, my own social life and my own friends and all of that, and I didn't feel like, I was there to learn, I was there to work, and I did well. I got first, and I applied myself, and stuff like that. So that was what I was there for, and I'm very happy with the education I got there.
And was it like a gradual process of you becoming more confident then over your years in Trinity?
I think so, but I think it happened more afterwards, after that I became more confident in terms of, I hadn't been a shy, retiring type in every facet of my life before that, you know what I mean? It was just like, speaking in tutorials and stuff I found intimidating, in this academic context. Whereas like out with my friends, you know what I mean? I'd be, the life and soul of the party. But I suppose after that, I remember, I think it's a really good like heuristic actually, for anything people are nervous about is that like, slow baby steps or whatever. Because when my book came out, I did like local radio pre-recorded, then national radio pre-recorded, then local radio live, then national radio live, then I was on telly pre-recorded, then live telly and stuff. So yeah.
Sorry, can I just check then? So when did you finish the degree and when did you write the novel, Dublin Seven?
Yeah, so I finished the degree then, what must have been 2011 or something like that. And I wrote the novel then, kind of over the next 2 years, I think. No, like, I wrote the novel very fast. Sorry, I had been doing writing and, writing little bits and pieces and stuff like that. And I'm kind of including that in writing the novel. But no, I wrote the novel after I finished the degree, kind of during the masters, in and around that time.
Okay, so yeah, I was a bit confused then. You went straight from the degree into doing the masters. Is that when you got the scholarship?
No, I got the scholarship after the masters. So I got the scholarship. I got the Usher Fellowship then to do the PhD. But the PhD went over time because I suppose the novel took up a lot of stuff. But my dad passed away then in the middle of it, and it ended up going taking a couple more years than I expected. So the money ended up flowing in the opposite direction, and I much preferred it when it was going from Trinity to me rather than from me to Trinity.
Right. So a lot happened, like basically between going back to college, bringing out a novel, doing your master's, getting a scholarship, writing a PhD. That's a pretty intensive few years. And you wrote articles as well.
Yeah. I suppose it sounds like, I had this really high work rate or whatever. It didn't feel like that. I find doing a hour, half hour with writings certainly more productive than sitting in front of a computer for 5 hours kind of staring at the blank screen. So, and as well as that, I kind of work at my own pace and to my own schedule. Like, I'm kind of more of a night owl than a morning person or whatever. And I might do a little bit of work at the weekends and take a day off midweek or whatever. So it didn't feel like I was under mad pressure or anything. So yeah.
And if you were to choose now, I mean, do you feel like you're pulled in the direction of academia and of writing, or are they compatible? Do you want both?
To me, they're absolutely complementary. And, I find it incredible. Like, for example, Ulysses, I found it a difficult text. And it's a book that changed my life, that I love. I think it's, the greatest novel of all time. But I wonder, would I have read it if I hadn't had a year as an undergraduate studying it. And we went to a tutorial every week and discussed it. And, we had the greatest Joycean scholar in the world, Professor Sam Sloat, illuminating those elements of the text that are kind of hard to decipher. So, say Ulysses has influenced me then as a writer as well. But also, like, the stuff like, so for example, the stuff I was talking about looking at novels, I very much made my novel about that and had lots of visual things in it. So, for example, set in 2004, that's the time when people were texting on those little Nokias, and I got the editor got for me, he got the exact font, the Nokia font, and we used that in the text messages. So it really gives that sense of texting at that time. And there's other little snippets like that are, purely visual, that are in the novel. So I find the academic study of literature and writing, absolutely, it's a perfect yin yang for me, and I'd love to continue to do both.
Mm-hmm. I remember, like Ulysses, I didn't do an undergrad in English, but I broke my ankle once playing soccer with my son when he was really small. And so I think it was 6 weeks in a cast. And I thought, now I'll read Ulysses, because I couldn't do anything. So I did. I read it. And sure, I think I didn't really understand it because I was just reading it on my own. But I got to the last chapter, Molly Bloom's soliloquy, I think is the last chapter. And I thought, oh my God. When I got to that, I thought it was worth it just to get to here, to read that at the end.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Didn't think you didn't need anything to read that last chapter and just immerse yourself in it. To me, it was such a pleasure when I got to that point. But a lot of the rest of it, to be honest, it was hard work.
It's absolutely, but I think, it's helpful if you approach it with the kind of idea, if I understand 10% of this, that's fine. You don't have to understand every bit of it. And if you go in with that kind of attitude, you kind of appreciate the little nuggets that you do get. We're kind of probably overemphasizing how difficult it is as well. Like, in hindsight, it does feel like a struggle, but if you pick it up and read it for a second time, it's much easier. But I think also as well, if people are interested in reading it, if they watch the films, there's 2 film versions. There's a 1960s film version, and there is one with Stephen Ree called Bloom, and the same actress that played Imelda Quirk in The Commitments. What's her name? Angeline Ball plays Molly Bloom in that, and she's just brilliant. She's the archetypal Molly Bloom for me. And I think Joyce would have approved of those film versions. Like, neither of those film versions is perfect, but of course Ulysses is a translation of the Greek myths. But even Joyce called it Ulysses as well to emphasize that it had already been translated, because that's the Roman name. So he didn't call it Odysseus. He called it Ulysses. And I think Joyce saw it as an iteration of this story, and would have totally approved of other people telling it in different ways and stuff like that. And I think, I'd seen the Bloom film before I read it. And I think that really helped give me a sense of kind of what it was about, and stuff like that. So, it's not a book that you don't need, you need to avoid spoilers for. I mean, the story is a man goes for a walk in Dublin for a day. Nothing's gonna, ruin the thing for you. You know what I mean? So, there's a brilliant book called Ulysses Unbound by Terence Killeen. It's a very short book, but it gives like an explanation of every chapter. And if you read it, Ulysses chapter by chapter, and then read the little explanation by Terence Killeen, I think that's also a good way to do it on your own if anyone is interested in reading Ulysses. But my professor, Sam Sloat, says to me that if you check secondhand copies of Ulysses, if you check, there's 3 places, and it'll usually be thumbed to either one of those 3 spots. There's 3 places where people typically give up. So you can look at it, and it's usually the same page that people just give up on.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because it's so difficult to read.
Yeah, well, you know yourself. There's bits in it when it just turns into completely indecipherable stuff, like the Oxen of the Sun chapter, when it suddenly. I think that's probably the best chapter to explain what Ulysses is about. So, each episode of Ulysses, each chapter is in a different style that corresponds to the content of that chapter. And this was Joyce's aesthetic. Like, Joyce had a picture on his study wall of his dad's home city of Cork, and the frame of that picture was made out of Cork wood. So, form matching content or whatever. And that chapter in Ulysses is set in the maternity hospital in Holles Street, where I was born. And that chapter has 9 parts, and each one is in a different style of English, going from Chaucerian English through Middle English to, Victorian Gothic, up to Cockney rhyme and slang, let's say. And so each of those 9 parts corresponds to 1 month of fetal development, because it's in a maternity hospital. So, yeah, it can be a bit confusing if you're not prepared for it.
Did you ever read Finnegan's Wake?
No, I haven't. I've obviously I've read bits of it. I keep it in my toilet. I think Joyce would have approved of that as well, because it's a book you can pick up and just, read a snatch of. But it's not a book that spoke to me. It's, but
Ulysses did.
Yeah, massively. And again, it's because it's so Dublin centric, I suppose, and loads of those places are still there. And
if you were to put your finger on exactly what it was about it that captured you, what was it?
Like, initially, probably that Dublin thing, and this kind of like patriotism for my home city, sort of, probably. But then the thing that really touched me is the kindness and humanity in it, and the gentleness in it, I suppose. I think Leopold Bloom is a very gentle character, and very compelling, and his interior life is very touching, or being propelled into people's interior lives is very moving in the way that Joyce does it, in a way that's very It's like Joyce is like, if you were to have a cinematic comparison, if we're talking about, like, you remember the stop motion dinosaurs that they had in movies from the 1950s, and then if you compare that to Jurassic Park with the CGI, where it's like, nearly photorealistic or whatever, I think Joyce's method of conveying interior monologue is much more immersive and much more realistic than previous authors. So there's a bit in it, when in one of the episodes you go through various people's interior monologues, some just random people in Dublin, and there's a boy, it's his dad's funeral that day, Paddy Dignam, and it's his son, and he's thinking about what it means that his dad's dead, and that's very touching, and you suddenly think about all of these people, and I think it encourages empathy. You think about all of these people; they each have an interior life like yours. So it's kind of the anti-solipsistic manifesto or something like that. You could put it that way.
In one of the articles I read about you, you spoke about Ulysses, and you said about that a teacher that the only response to the ups and downs of life is to embrace them and to say yes, like Molly Bloom. I actually wrote it down because I love that. So that must have been something you got from Ulysses.
Yeah, definitely. Like I've gone through, I think, some hard times when I read it, and when I read that chapter that you like Molly Bloom soliloquy as well. And I think that is the message. Like, don't give me credit for that, because I think that's Joyce's message is, yes. Like Leopold Bloom goes through various emotions during that day, from despondency to jubilance, and everything in between, sexual arousal, and, all sorts of stuff. And I think that Joyce chose to end with the word yes. I think, like everything that Joyce put in the novel, and I think why it's so great, is that everything has significance. And I think that definitely was an affirmation for life, and to say yes to life. I mean, what else are you going to do,
Is there an element of, like, do you like myth in general?
I've developed an interest in narratology now. It wasn't something that I've always had or understood the importance of. And I remember my ma trying to talk to me about it. And, I didn't like mythology. I wanted to find out, say, about the Celts. And my ma handed me a book on Celtic mythology. And I was like, yeah, this is this nonsense they believed in. You know what I mean? It's not pertinent. And, I think I had a point in it, step, because what I wanted to know was, the fundamentals of history, where they came from, when they came, this kind of stuff. And it's a different thing. But I think linguistics really encouraged an interest in narratology, because I'm a big believer in Chomsky's universal grammar, and I think it's important as well to pose that as a counterpoint to this kind of linguistic relativism. That's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and that's the idea that language determines the way you're taught. So different languages make you see the world in fundamentally different ways. And I don't agree with that. Different languages certainly make you conceive of certain things in different ways, and it can affect your mode of thinking, or your mode of looking at things. But, I think the most remarkable thing about different languages is their similarity. Human language has this fundamental structure: subject, verb, object. We all have a recursion, which is the ability to bed clauses within each other. And that's the definitive thing about human language, I think. And I think if we look at humans as well, we're, all of this stuff about racial differences and stuff like this, we're remarkably, as a species, the same. And what has allowed us to proliferate and occupy the whole world, all of these different climates, without biological changes, without significant biological changes, I mean, skin deep our racial differences, is our use of language, our ability to cooperate, and our ability to use complex social organization and technology and stuff like that I think is derived from language. So I think the similarities in language are much, much more significant and important than the differences in language. And I think then that's true of myth and stories and stuff like that as well.
I was going to say that, yeah, like that, like even Joseph Campbell, who wrote about Finnegan's Wake and who writes about the monomyth. You know, that the same myths are there across cultures. Every culture, or I don't know if every culture, but the idea of the flood, you know, it's there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great kind of mad book by Christopher Booker, and it's called Just Seven Stories. And he says that there's, you know, basically seven stories, but they're also just one story as well. You know, Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. But there's, you know, defeating the monster. There's the marriage plot. There is the quest. Stuff like this. And you know, it's interesting, you know, how ingrained these things are as cultural archetypes. So, for example, I hadn't encountered that theory or read about it until after I'd written my novel. And one of the aspects Christopher Booker says about the hero's journey is the call to action. And the call to action is initially rejected. So Bilbo Baggins doesn't want to go on the journey, you know, and Gandalf then, you know, kind of railroads him into it. Luke Skywalker, I think the same kind of thing, you know. And, you know, my book is about gangland and a young fella getting involved in crime. And initially, this fella offers to set him up drug dealing, and he says no. And then a few weeks later, he changes his mind. So, you know, my story was conforming to this archetype that I didn't consciously know about, yet was ingrained somewhere within me. And I think that's language works that way as well, because everybody is an expert on language. They just don't know it. We all do these complex grammatical permutations and, you know, conform our language to very complex grammatical rules, but we couldn't articulate, most of us, you know, couldn't articulate those rules if we tried, yet they are in there. You know, so I think there's definitely interesting correspondences there between linguistics and narratology.
I actually often find that when people try to write in a way that they think they should write, they go wrong. That it's almost like a natural, you know, with students, for example, if they're writing and they think there's a way they should write rather than just writing the way they would, you know, organically, then they get it right when they do it without thinking too much about it. But when they start trying to think about it, sometimes the sentences end up tripping over themselves.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I have a thing with names, you know. I think it's good to find a name with significance, because I think if you try and make a plausible name, it sounds ridiculous. If you try and like pick a name out of a phone book and put two names together, for some reason they just never sounded realistic to me. Whereas if I picked a name that had some symbolism in it, it worked much more. You know, I don't know if that's just me, but like, yeah, I think that they're you know, there's a kind of instinctive element to writing.
Yeah.
That if you tap into that, it can work a lot better than you know, consciously trying to construct something.
I mean, I know you're reluctant to talk about the next thing that I'm going to bring up. But I mean, how I got to know you or came across you for the first time was you wrote an article, was it 2017? I think it was 2017. And it was about identity politics. It was published in the Irish Times. And subsequently, there was a bit of a storm about it. Would you say you were cancelled as a result of it?
I don't know. You know, I suppose people would say that I wasn't, because, you know, I still exist or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, I suppose, yeah, certainly there was social stigma attached to me, or that's the way it generally works anyway. I suppose the reason that I'm generally reluctant to talk about it is because it kind of became what I was known best for when it's not my primary interest. Like, for example, as well, I wrote, you know, 7 articles, say, or 6 articles about police corruption, big article about travellers that I'm most proud of. And these would have all conformed to kind of the, you know, left-wing accepted ideology on the left. And this was one article that's critical of the left, and that became, you know, the biggest thing that I wrote. And that was inadvertent. You know, I haven't really, you know, written any more articles. Well, I think I wrote one maybe that was focused on criticising the left. So yeah, it's not my main what would you call it, focus, I suppose, but it became the main focus. So
yeah. I mean, I read the articles again in advance of chatting with you today. And I agreed with your points. I mean, identity politics is one of your points. Identity politics is utterly ineffective at anything other than dividing people. And I found it, and I read again the response, the letter, the hashtag Cop On Comrades, and I felt like you were being misinterpreted and your words were being twisted around a bit in that letter. And at the time, I remember being a bit confused about why people were going for you. Like, I didn't really understand it, why the reaction was so vicious, I would say, in some ways.
Yeah, I suppose, I want to be fair about it. So I would say that the term identity politics, I should have made a distinction there. I was using the term to refer to something that, phenomenon that I understood as identity politics. And that did not mean, all women's liberation, all gay rights, all anti-racism, which some people took it up as. And, it's understandable. Okay. It's politics that are centered around identity, but identity politics to me meant, kind of belated, modern American campus style, form of identity politics that tends not to have a class analysis involved in it and has been co-opted by neoliberalism. And that's what I meant by the term. That maybe that wasn't clear from the article, so maybe that contributed to the furore around it. The headline as well, I didn't pick, and I think this is a practice that has to stop. Was
that the headline? The bit that I read out. Identity politics is utterly ineffective at anything other than dividing people.
I would say that a certain style of identity politics is ineffective at anything other than dividing people. But I wouldn't say identity politics, full stop, because I think it's too amorphous a term now, But no, that wasn't the headline. The initial headline, the headline that they gave it was, it's idiotic equating straight white men with privilege or something like that. I forget what the headline they gave it was, but loads of people just reacted to the headline, and that's the world we live in. That's the way of the world, So
well, look, it was thought-provoking. It got people talking and thinking about these things. I often think in terms of identity that we have become, there is a tendency for people to latch onto one or a few aspects of identity. I teach Buddhism as one of the religions that I teach about, and in it, that we're made up. We're constantly changing, first of all, but we're made up of 5 what they call skandhas or aggregates. And each of them, so it's the physical form, it's feeling, it's thinking, it's action and consciousness. But even within action, there's something like 36 different mental activities. And I think that we're so complex as human beings that sometimes with this thing of identity, it reduces people to very simplistic ways of understanding them or what they belong to. I think everybody's so complex. We're humans, we're made up of so many different aspects. So
absolutely, and I think absolutely agree with you. One of the things that has been thrown at me and thrown at a lot of people that I admire, writers that I admire, is the term class reductionism. So they'd say you're always a class reductionist, and that you think that the only important determining factor is class. I don't think that's true of myself, but okay, if people want to call me a class reductionist, I'm okay with that. It's better than some of the things I've been called.
Is that because you would say that class is a very important factor?
Yeah, I do think it's an important factor, but I also think it's the factor that tends to get left out of these discussions.
I was going to say, yeah. Sorry, go on.
So Adolf Reed has pointed out that this term gets thrown around a lot, class reductionist, by people who are invested in identity politics, but they don't say to people you're a race reductionist. They don't say that very much, and which is more common on the left, race reductionism or class reductionism. I mean, if we're talking about, say, police brutality and police violence, certainly there's been racially based police violence, in different parts of the world, and horrific acts of murder and oppression based on that. But class is a salient aspect in lots of those scenarios as well. In many of them, probably a more salient, even when there is race involved. Domestically, certainly class has been an enormous determinant of how people are policed. So, for example, drugs are taken in every social class in Ireland, and only one social class gets policed on the basis of their drug use, and that is the working class. I think identity reductionism is much, much more prevalent and much more damaging on the left than class reductionism. And the reason for that is because if you apply a class lens to issues, the solution will be the material redistribution of wealth. And that will disproportionately benefit people of marginalised identities because they are disproportionately poor. And that doesn't work the other way around. If you misapply an identity lens to an issue, you're not going to solve people's problems by having more diversity in academia or in media or whatever. That's only masking the problem. What people need is housing, healthcare, and education. And people of all identities need that. And people of all identities deserve that, in my opinion. And I think the focus on... I think that a lot of times the way identity is focused on is in a way that benefits the professional managerial class. These people who have who are invested in very academicized politics that aims generally at representation rather than redistribution. And I don't think that is beneficial to the general mass or the majority of people of whatever identity. You know what I mean? Like, look, it sounds reductive or whatever, but I think people need housing, healthcare, and education, and I don't think they're getting the housing, healthcare, and education that they need in this country generally. And we're a rich country; we can afford it. So that's why I think we need a universalist redistributive politics that is, and that's what a class focus should be.
Yeah, I agree. And I actually think that the focus on different elements of identity, it's a distraction from those issues. And I agree as well that it's often the one that's excluded or not really discussed or focused on. Whereas if it was, ideally it would, raise everybody's boat, regardless of what identity group they belong to.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I don't know if you've seen this, but the CIA just put out a video, Humans of the CIA, and it's this young Latino woman that's working for the or Latina woman or whatever the correct Latinx woman or whatever the term is, the current term is, who's working for the CIA, and she talks about being cisgender millennial with anxiety and how she's intersectional and all of this shit. And she's working for the CIA, the people that kill trade unionists in South America, that brought us theocracy in Iran, that are to a large part responsible for 2 million dead in Iraq, for a conflagration of hell in Libya. And if they are promoting your politics, you need to do some introspection here about how revolutionary your politics are. And okay, fine, if you want to keep pushing this politics, that's grand. I'm not here calling anybody out, personally by name or whatever, and shaming them for it. But don't sit there like Che Guevara when you're pushing on an open door. It's not a coincidence, this stuff. I mean, class is not in the equality legislation. Race, gender, sexuality, that stuff is in the equality legislation. Class isn't. The Open Society's grants, if you look at them, it's all kind of sex work and racial politics and gender politics and all of this sort of stuff, and class generally isn't included in the Open Society's grants and stuff like this. And same for many foundations and NGOs and stuff like that. And there's a reason for that. You know what I mean? It's because class is the one. Everybody's in favor of equality until it hurts their pocket. And the ruling class are attempting to make a settlement with a section of the professional managerial class of marginalised identities in the hope of, buying off the professional managerial class of the left, basically. Someone I know called them the NGO industrial complex. And this is a fact. You know what I mean? Like, and to kind of to acknowledge that and to recognize we're not living in the 1950s is not to be against women's liberation or to be against anti-racism or to be, like Fred Hampton is a great inspiration to me. And he said, you don't fight fire with fire, you don't fight racism with more racism. You fight it with solidarity. And he said what people are really scared of is people of all identities coming together in a universalist basis. And he said anybody that was interested in the revolution knew that. And I think those ideas now, like, I mean, people would call Fred Hampton a class reductionist if he was putting out that stuff out now. I mean, Adolph Reed, brilliant black academic, gets called a class reductionist for putting forward similar ideas. So, look, it is the world we live in, but these politics are hegemonic in lots of areas. Neoliberalism is, pinkwashing, draping itself in a rainbow flag, and this is happening. So to pretend it's not, is not to, I suppose is sticking your head in the sand. And to oppose the neoliberal version of identity politics, which I should have been more specific about. It's neoliberal identity politics that I object to. It's not women's liberation or gay rights or anti-racism.
I don't think so. I mean, I did reread your article twice this morning, actually, and at no point did you say you were against women's liberation or you were against. So I don't know that interpretation. There was a choice, somebody chose to interpret it that way. And sure, look, you can interpret anything anyway, in a way, can you?
Yeah. Well,
it's like the left is suffocated by this stuff, I think, in many regards.
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, you only have to look at the weaponization of these kind of issues. In the case of Jeremy Corbyn, for instance, who was smeared as an anti-Semite, to see how these things can be abused. Like, it's incredibly important like, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, it was famously said. And it's incredibly important to fight anti-Semitism. I mean, when George Soros gets abused for being Jewish, that should be, absolutely rejected. George Soros is not bad because he's a Jew. George Soros, the problem with George Soros is that he's a billionaire, and there shouldn't be any billionaires, and he's one of many billionaires, like the Koch brothers, who use their capital in nefarious ways and stuff like this. So, when Jeremy Corbyn was smeared, a lifelong anti-racism campaigner, as an anti-Semite, that should have rang alarm bells about how this stuff can be weaponized very effectively against the left. In the current kind of climate. But, like, look, the victor's right to history. I don't think I'm going to persuade anybody. And certainly, you're saying, people chose to interpret that way, but communication is a two-way street. And the article certainly didn't have the effect I wanted it to have. So, I suppose maybe I should respect on that.
Right. Can we'll start to wrap it up, I think, but I wanted to ask you, like, your plans now. So you finished the PhD and you mentioned that you're still writing and you're doing academic work. What's the dream, or where do you see yourself going, or where would you like to go?
Well, I'd like, as I said, I see academic study of literature and writing as a perfect yin yang for me. So, I'd like to continue that. I'm writing. I don't know what's going to be the next book yet. I'm not 100% sure. I have a few things in the pipeline, but one of the things I do that I find is very productive is to keep a notebook and write down little snippets, often of just conversation, that I find are interesting. And certainly I think Dublin is a wealthy store of those little gems. Like, one of the things that's in my notebook for a future book is a taxi driver was saying to me, about the changing health advice and dietary nutrition and stuff like that. And he was saying, the butter's good for you now again, apparently. But the bread is bad. What am I meant to do? Smear it on my big toe? So when people say something funny, or, it might not be something funny, it might just be a little, peculiar phrase or something like that, I write it down. And not only does it provide brilliant material for you to draw upon, like when I wrote my first book, really, it was almost like a collage, because I had all of these little notes and just lashed them all together into a book. But not only does it provide material for writing, it makes life kind of more significant or more enjoyable, because you're watching out for these things, or you're appreciating them and appreciating the significance of how people talk and what people say in a way that you aren't if you're not writing it down. So, yeah, that's that might be a good tip for people who are interested in writing or, just interested in the way people talk.
It's quite meditative or something like, no, I mean, because if you're doing that, then your attention has to be focused on the minute. You're very aware of the conversation as it's happening, of like, I suppose the surround as well. Do you ever have a lucid dream?
Have I ever had a lucid dream? Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Ah, I wonder if that's connected.
I don't know. My friends would disagree with you because they would say, sometimes we're on the session and next thing I'll whack out the notebook and they're like, oh, for fuck's sake, can you not just enjoy yourself like a normal human being,
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. Probably there's a balance.
Yeah, possibly. But, then again, some of the things that were said on sessions are some of the funniest things that I've ever written down.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah. Great material. So, right. Is there anything else that you'd like to say? Is there anything that I haven't covered that you'd like to?
There is actually, Colette. I wanted to make sure to say that, when I was getting a lot of criticism, let's say, over my article, it really meant a lot to me that you reached out and, publicly as well, were supportive. And I think in a very reasonable way, you know what I mean? I think it was hard when you're in that kind of situation, on either side. It's hard to see the wood for the trees, and tempers are very inflamed and stuff like that. And I think you were very restrained and rational, and it meant an awful lot to me. But I think it was also brave. I really admire that, and I think you're still like that. You're very inquisitive and very sincere and honest in your opinions, but also about your lack of knowledge. And one of the things that I find bad sometimes about academia is people don't want to say that they didn't read Nietzsche or something, but you can't read everybody. Do you know what I mean? So if I meet Des Ryan, and like I remember I said to him one time, oh, I was ensconced there with a book, and he's like, this guy's a linguist, and he says, what does ensconced mean? And he's absolutely shameless in saying what he doesn't know. And I think that's a really good and characteristic, and it's actually a sign of intellectual strength that people, it's insecurity that stops people saying that. So I'm really glad that we've developed a friendship and all from this. It's one of the good things to come out of getting piled on. But I can't express enough how much it meant to me and how much I admire you for your stances on these things.
Sure. No bother. I mean, I didn't know you. I didn't know the people who wrote the letter. I just read both things. I read the different, and I just tried to figure out my own opinion. And I don't like, anyway, when there's a big, huge pile-on. I tend to think it's very easy within a group to just go with the group.
Yeah.
It's like a fish in a shoal. The one
Yeah. The only dead things go with the flow. Only live things swim against the stream. That's someone said that, didn't he? It was Chesterton, I think.
That's nice.
Yeah. But I agree with you as well. I think people have kind of characterized me as being bitter about getting piled on and all of that. And I am. Listen, I'm not going to lie. But the other thing is the article was about that, about people getting piled on. It says the most shameful thing about this kind of politics is the flagellation of heretics. So I wrote the article because I was against it. And, listen, if I'm excluded from the left of the group, that's fine with me. I don't want to be a part of this kind of thing. And I'd be happier to have written something and be excluded than to go along with kind of stuff I don't agree with. So I think you're very much of that same mindset, but probably more so than me, because I've kind of tried to stay out of all of this milieu for a long time, whereas you're very forthright and very you've great integrity about your intellectual life, let's say.
Thank you. Don't know how true that is, but I mean, I do know I don't necessarily like being part of groups because there's dangers. But I'm sure there's good things being, there's good things in groups as well. But I was wondering then, in the Ulysses quote that I read in that article, which you had written before that happened, the only response to the ups and downs of life, embrace them and say yes, like Molly Bloom. So will we leave it on that note then?
Yeah, that's always a good note to leave it on. Molly Bloom. We'll give her the final word for sure.
That's it for this episode of Spokes. There is more information in the show notes and with links to some other articles and details on Frankie's work. If you like today's episode, check out some of our previous recordings. And don't forget to like and subscribe.
Spokes is produced by Colette Colfer and Terry Hackett.